Good afternoon, everybody. Happy Thursday. I'm Charlotte, and this is Quarantine Story Time. And we have been reading War and Peace, as you may recall, if you've been here before. And if not, if this is your first time, welcome. We're reading War and Peace, and we are getting really close to the end, friends. And to that end, I have been kind of making the reading slightly longer. Yesterday was extremely long, actually. I usually try to keep it under an hour. Yesterday was like about an hour and 15. And unfortunately, today we might actually do that as well, just because of the way the next few parts of the book are broken up. It's going to either be awkward, we'll do a bunch of short readings, or we just do a few bigger, longer readings, which I think in the end will be better, since I really am hoping that we can really start wrapping this book up sooner, especially as like summer is actually starting to come to a close. It's already August. We've been reading this since April, I think. So April, May, June, July, August. 5 months. I'd like to get it done in under 6 months, I think, if we could. So sooner would be better. And I also think we're really getting into the characters, and we're getting down to a lot of the drama. People are possibly dying, there's war, and so let's just keep moving along. So if you need a refresher, you can always check out, I have a War and Peace playlist on my channel that has all the readings, and you can use that to catch up. If you are caught up, I'll just remind you that last time Sonia wrote Nikolai Rostov a letter releasing him of his promise to marry her. So, they had this promise that they were going to get married, kind of like an engagement. I don't know if it was as formal as an engagement, but like that. And there's been a lot of pressure for her to not marry him because of like the family's poor financial situation. It would be better if he married someone wealthy, and Sonia is completely without any financial backing. She's been raised by the family and taken care of by their family because her own family is not able. So she had long been very giving to the family, but this is the one thing that she did not want to give up, was her love for Nikolai. Even though I'm not sure that even though Nikolai loves her, I'm not really sure he loves her the same way she loves him. But because Prince Natasha has found the injured Prince Andrei and is helping him recuperate, Sonia they think that he might recover. And so she's hoping that him recovering and him and Natasha could be reunited. And therefore, if they're reunited and they become engaged and married, Nikolai couldn't marry Prince Andrei's sister, Princess Maria, who it is now looking like he has an interest in, and that there's some mutual affection and attraction between the two of them. And so Sonia was not going to release Nikolai of the promise. She loves him very much, but now she's thinking, well, if his sister gets married to Prince Andrei, he can't marry Princess Maria, so I can go ahead and release him as if I am, giving the family what they want, but he still won't be able to marry her. So she's hoping that even though he's released, he will love her enough to come back to her, seeing as he probably won't be able to marry Princess Maria. I'm not 100% sure that Prince Andrei is going to recover, so I don't know if her plan is really going to work out that well. And like I said, I'm not really sure that he loves her the same way she loves him, and I'm wondering if there might be a better match as far as personality and attraction between him and Princess Maria. And maybe I'm materialistic and just like wanting the family to do okay, because they're doing badly because the dad is like an airhead, a very giving, loving airhead who just spends too much money. So I feel bad for them for that. But, it is what it is. Gotta face the music. So, hey, I have the live chat up. Feel free to say hi. Let's jump in. Like I said, it's a long reading again today, but that will put us at the end of Volume 4, Part 1. So, I believe there's 4 parts in Volume 4, and then there is a chunk of an epilogue after that. So that actually may take some time, even more, not maybe almost as much as Volume 4. It's not too bad. I actually think we'll be done in a couple weeks if we keep carrying on. So let's do that. Without further ado, Section 9. In the guardhouse where Pierre was taken, remember Pierre is in Moscow still and has been arrested because they thought he might be someone who was setting fires in Moscow, even though all he was doing was trying to assassinate Napoleon and help the people left in Moscow from the looting army. So there you have it. So he's been arrested by French soldiers. Section 9. In the guardhouse where Pierre was taken, the officers and soldiers who had arrested him treated him hostilely, but at the same time respectfully. In their attitude towards him, doubt could still be felt of who he was, perhaps a very important person, and hostility because of the still fresh personal struggle with him. But when another shift came in the next morning, Pierre felt that for these new guards, both officers and soldiers, he did not have the same meaning he had for those who arrested him. And indeed, in this large, fat man in a peasant's caftan, the next day, guards no longer saw the living man who had fought so desperately with a looter and the convoy soldiers and had spoken the solemn phrase about saving a child, but saw only the 17th arrested Russian kept there for some reason on orders from the high command. If there was anything special in Pierre, it was only in his untimid, concentratedly thoughtful air, and the French which, surprisingly for the French, he spoke very well. Despite which, on that same day, Pierre was put together with the other arrested suspects because the separate room he had occupied was needed for an officer. All the Russians held together with Pierre were people of the lowest estate. Almost all of them, recognizing Pierre as a gentleman, shunned him, the more so as he spoke French. Pierre listened with sadness to their mockery of him. That evening, Pierre learned that all these prisoners, and probably he among them, were to be tried for arson. On the third day, Pierre was taken with the others to some house where a French general with white mustaches sat with 2 colonels and other Frenchmen with armbands. With that precision and definiteness, which is supposedly above human weakness, and with which the accused are usually treated, Pierre, like the others, was questioned about who he was, where he had been, and with what purpose, and so on. These questions, leaving aside the essence of life's business and excluding any possibility of discovering that essence, like all questions asked at trials, were aimed at only furnishing that channel down which the judges wish the answers of the accused to flow, leading him to the desired goal, that is, incrimination. As soon as he began to say something that did not conform to the purpose of incrimination, the channel was removed and the water could flow wherever it liked. Besides that, Pierre experienced the same thing that an accused man experiences in any court, perplexity as to why all these questions were being asked of him. He had the feeling that this trick of furnishing him with a channel was being used only out of indulgence or courtesy, as it were. He knew that he was in the power of these people, and that it was only power that had brought him there, that only power gave them the right to demand answers to their questions, and that the only purpose of this gathering was to incriminate him. And therefore, since there was power and the wish to incriminate, there was no need for trickery of questions in a trial. It was obvious that all questions should lead to finding him guilty. To the question of what he was doing when they arrested him, he answered quite tragically that he was carrying a child, qu'il avait sauvé des flammes, that he had saved from the flames, to her parents. Why had he fought with the looter? Pierre answered that he was defending a woman, that to defend a defended woman was the duty of every man. That he was stopped. That did not suit the case. Why was he in the yard of the burning house where the witnesses had seen him? He answered that he had gone out to seek what was happening in Moscow. He was stopped again. He had not been asked where he was going, but why he was near the fire. Who was he? They repeated to him their first question, which he had told them he did not want to answer. Again he said that he could not tell them. Write that down, it's bad, very bad, the general with the white mustaches and flushed, ruddy face said sternly to him. On the 4th day, fires broke out on the Zubovsky rampart. Pierre and 13 others were led to the Kremitsky ford, to the carriage shed of a merchant's house. Going down the streets, Pierre choked from the smoke, which seemed to hang over the whole city. Fires could be seen on all sides. At that time, Pierre did not understand the significance of the burning of Moscow and looked at these fires with horror. Pierre spent 4 more days in the carriage shed of the house near the Kremitsky ford, and in the course of those days he learned from the conversation of the French soldiers that all those held there were awaiting the marshal's decision any day. What marshal, Pierre could not find out from the soldiers. Apparently, for the soldiers, a marshal was a supreme and somewhat mysterious link in a chain of power. Those first days, until the 8th of September, the day when the prisoners were taken for a second interrogation, were the hardest for Pierre. Section 10. On the 8th of September, an officer came into the prisoner's shed, a very important one, judging by the respect with which the guards addressed him. This officer, probably from the staff, with a list in his hands, made a roll call of all the Russians, referring to Pierre as celui qui ne veut pas son nom, he who does not divulge his name, and looked indifferently and lazily over all the prisoners, ordered the officer of the guards to get them decently dressed, and tidied up before bringing them to the marshal. An hour later, a company of soldiers arrived, and Pierre and the other 13 were led to the Deviche field. The day was clear and sunny after rain, and the air was extraordinarily pure. The smoke did not spread as low as on the day when Pierre was taken from the guardhouse of the Zybovsky rampart. The smoke rose in columns in the pure air. Flames were not seen anywhere, but columns of smoke rose on all sides, and the whole of Moscow, all that Pierre could see of it, was one charred ruin. On all sides one could see waste spaces with stoves and chimneys and occasionally the scorched walls of stone houses. Pierre looked at the charred ruins and did not recognize the familiar quarters of the city. Here and there he could see intact churches. The Kremlin, undestroyed, stood white in the distance, with its towers and Ivan the Great. Nearby, the dome of the Novodevichy convent gleamed merrily, and the ringing of its bells could be heard especially clearly. This bell ringing reminded Pierre that it was Sunday and the feast of the Nativity of the Mother of God, but it seemed there was no one to celebrate the feast. The fire's devastation was everywhere, and the only Russians to be met now and then were ragged, frightened people who hid at the sight of the French. Obviously, the Russian nest was devastated and destroyed, but beyond the destruction of the Russian order of life, Pierre felt unconsciously that the French had established their own quite different but firm order over this devastated nest. He felt it by the look of the soldiers who, marching briskly and cheerfully in regular ranks, escorted him along with their other criminals. He felt it by the look of the important French official in a carriage and pair, driven by a soldier who came in the opposite direction. He felt it by the cheerful sound of regimental music coming from the left side of the field, and he felt it and realized it especially by the list which, in the roll call of the prisoners, was read out by the French officer who had arrived that morning. Pierre had been arrested by one group of soldiers, had been taken to one place, and then another with dozens of other people. It seemed they might have forgotten him or confused him with others, but no, the answer he had given at the interrogation came back to him in the form of his designation, celui qui n'en veut pas son nom, he who does not divulge his name. And under this designation, which frightened Pierre, he was now led somewhere by people on whose faces was written the unquestioning certainty that all the other prisoners and he himself were precisely the necessary ones and were being taken to the necessary place. Pierre felt like an insignificant chip of wood fallen into the wheels of a machine, unknown to him but functioning well. Pierre and the other criminals were taken to the right side of the Deviche field, not far from the convent, to a big white house with a huge garden. This was the house of Prince Sherbatov, in which Pierre had often visited the owner, and in which, as he learned from the conversation of the soldiers, the marshal, the Duke of Eckmühl, was now stationed. They were led up to the porch and brought into the house one by one. Pierre was brought in sixth. Through the glassed-in gallery, the front hall, the anteroom, familiar to Pierre, he was led into a long, low study, and at the door to which stood an adjutant. Davout was sitting at the end of the room, over a table with spectacles on his nose. Pierre went up to him. Davout, not raising his eyes, was evidently examining some document that lay before him. Without raising his eyes, he asked softly, "Qu'est-ce-vous? Who are you?" Pierre was silent because he was unable to utter a sound. For Pierre, Davout was not simply a French general. For Pierre, Davout was a man known for his cruelty. Looking at the cold face of Davout, who, like a stern teacher, agreed to be patient for a time and wait for an answer, Pierre felt that every second of delay might cost him his life, but he did not know what to say. He did not dare to say what he had said at the first interrogation. To reveal his title and position was both dangerous and shameful. Pierre was silent. But before he had time to decide on something, Davout raised his head, raised his spectacles to his forehead, narrowed his eyes, and looked fixedly at Pierre. "I know this man," he said in a measured and cold voice, obviously calculated to frighten Pierre. The chill had run down Pierre's spine earlier, now seized his head as in a vice. "Mon général, vous ne pouvez pas me compter, je ne vous ai jamais vu." General, you cannot know me. I have never seen you. C'est un espion russe. He's a Russian spy, Davout interrupted him, addressing another general who was in the room and whom Pierre had not noticed. And Davout turned away. In an unexpectedly booming voice, Pierre began speaking quickly. Non, monseigneur, he said, suddenly recalling that Davout was a duke. Non, monseigneur, vous n'avez pas pour me contraire. Je suis un officier militaire et je n'ai pas quitte Moscow. No, my lord, you could not have known me. I am a militia officer, and I have not left Moscow. Votre nom, said Davout. Your name? Bezukhov. Qu'est-ce que me prouvera que vous ne mentez pas? How will you prove to me that you are not lying? Monseigneur, exclaimed Pierre, not in an offended but a pleading voice. Davout raised his eyes and looked fixedly at Pierre. For a few seconds they looked at each other, and that gaze saved Pierre. In that gaze, beyond all the conventions of war and courts, human relations were established between these two men. In that one moment they both vaguely felt a countless number of things and realized they were both children of the human race, and that they were brothers. At first glance, for Davout, who had only just raised his head from his list, where human deeds and life were known by numbers, Pierre was only a circumstance, and Davout could have shot him without taking a bad act on his conscience. And now he had seen him as a human being. He reflected for a moment. Comment me prouverez-vous la vérité de ce que vous me dites? How will you prove to me the truth of what you say? Davout said coldly. Pierre remembered Rambal and named him and his regiment in the street where the house was. Vous n'êtes pas ce que vous dites. You are not what you say, Davout said again. In a trembling, faltering voice, Pierre began to give proofs of the correctness of his evidence. But just then, an adjutant came in and reported something to Davout. Davout suddenly beamed at the news told him by the adjutant and began to button up. He had clearly forgotten all about Pierre. When the adjutant reminded him of the prisoner, he nodded, frowning, in Pierre's direction and said to take him away. But where he was to be taken, Pierre did not know. Back to the shed, or to the place prepared for executions, which his comrades had shown him as they walked through the Devichy field. He turned his head and saw the adjutant was again asking something. Oui, sans doute. Yes, undoubtedly, said Davout, but yes, what Pierre did not know. Pierre did not remember how long he walked or where. In a state of total senselessness and torpor, seeing nothing around him, he moved his legs along with the others until they all stopped, and he stopped too. There was one thing in Pierre's head all the time. It was the thought of who, finally, had sentenced him to be executed. It was not the people of the commission that had interrogated him. No one of them would or obviously could have done it. It was not Davout who had given him such a human look. Another moment, and Davout would have understood that they were doing a bad thing, but the adjutant who came in had prevented that moment, and that adjutant obviously had not wanted anything bad, but he also might not have come in. Who was it, finally, who was executing, killing, depriving of life, him, Pierre, with all his memories, longings, hopes, and thoughts? Who was doing it? And Pierre felt that it was no one. It was the order of things, the turn of circumstances. Some order of things was killing him, Pierre, depriving him of life, of everything, annihilating him. Section 11. From Prince Sherbatov's house, the prisoners were taken straight down the Devichy field to the left of the Devichy convent and brought to the kitchen garden where a post stood. Behind the post, a large pit had been dug, with freshly dug earth beside it, and a large group of people were standing in a semicircle around the pit and the post. The crowd consisted of a small number of Russians and a large number of Napoleonic troops out of rank, Germans, Italians, and French in various uniforms. To the right and left of the post stood lines of French troops in blue uniforms with red epaulettes in leggings and chapeaux. The criminals were placed in a certain order, which was on the list, Pierre was sixth, and led to the post. Several drums suddenly began to beat on both sides, and Pierre felt this sound. It was as if part of his soul was being torn away. He lost the ability to think and reason. He could only see and hear, and he had only one desire, the desire that whatever terrible thing was to be done should be done more quickly. Pierre looked around at his comrades and studied them. The first two men were convicts with shaven heads. One was tall and thin, and the other dark, shaggy, and muscular with a flattened nose. The third was a household serf of about 45, with grayish hair and a stout, well-stuffed body. The fourth was a muzhik, a very handsome one, with a bushy blonde beard and dark eyes. The fifth was a factory worker, thin, yellow-faced lad of about 18 in a smock. Pierre heard the French debate about how to shoot them, by ones or by twos. By twos, the senior officer said coldly and calmly. There was movement in the ranks of soldiers, and it was noticeable that they were all hurrying, and not hurrying as people hurry to do something everyone understands, but as to hurry in order to finish a necessary but unpleasant and incomprehensible business. A French officer in a sash went up to the right side of the file of criminals and read the sentence in Russian and in French. Then two pair of Frenchmen went up to the criminals and, on instructions from the officers, took the two convicts who stood first in line. The convicts, having gone to the post, stopped, and while the sacks were brought, looked silently around them as a wounded animal looks at the approaching hunter. One kept crossing himself, the other kept scratching his back and making a movement with his lips, similar to a smile. The soldiers, their hands hurrying, set about blindfolding them, putting sacks over their heads, and tying them to the post. Two riflemen with muskets left the ranks with measured, firm steps and stopped 8 paces from the post. Pierre turned away so as not to see what was going to happen. Suddenly there was a crack and a boom that to Pierre seemed louder than the most terrible peals of thunder, and he turned to look. There was smoke, and the Frenchmen, with pale faces and trembling hands, were doing something by the pit. Another 2 were led up. In the same way, with the same eyes, these 2 also looked at everyone, in vain, with their eyes only, silently, begging for protection, and clearly not understanding and not believing what was going to happen. They could not believe it, because they alone knew what their life was for them, and therefore did not understand or believe that it could be taken from them. Pierre did not want to look, and again turned away, but again it was as if a terrible explosion struck his hearing, and along with these noises he saw smoke, someone's blood, and the pale, frightened faces of the Frenchmen, who again were doing something by the post, pushing each other with trembling hands. Pierre, breathing hard, looked around as if asking, "What does it mean?" And the same question was in all the gazes that met Pierre's gaze. On all the Russian faces, on all the faces of the French soldiers and officers, on all, without exception, he read the same fear, horror, and struggle that were in his heart. But who, finally, is doing this? They're all suffering just as I am. Who is it? Who? Flashed for a second in Pierre's soul. Tirailleurs du 86th en avant. Riflemen of the 86th, forward, someone shouted. They led away the 5th man, who was standing next to Pierre, alone. Pierre did not understand that he was saved, that he and all the rest had been brought there only to be present at the execution. With an ever-increasing horror, feeling neither joy nor relief, he watched what was being done. The 5th man was the factory worker in the smock. As soon as they touched him, he jumped away in horror and clutched at Pierre. Pierre shuddered and tore free of him. The factory worker was unable to walk. He was dragged under the arms and was shouting something. When he was led to the post, he suddenly fell silent. It was as if he suddenly understood something. Either he understood that it was useless to shout, or that it was impossible that people should kill him, but he stood by the post, waiting to be bound as the others had been, like a wounded animal, looking around with glittering eyes. Pierre could no longer make himself turn away and close his eyes. His own and the whole crowd's curiosity and agitation at this 5th murder had reached the highest pitch. Like the others, this 5th man seemed calm. He wrapped himself into his smock and scratched his leg with his bare foot. When they set about blindfolding him, he himself straightened the knot at the back of his head, which hurt him. And then, when he was put up against the bloody post, he leaned back, and feeling uncomfortable in that position, straightened up, placed his feet level, and leaned back comfortably. Pierre did not take his eyes off of him, not missing a single movement. It must have been that the command was given. It must have been that after the command the shot of 8 muskets rang out. But Pierre, much as he tried to recall it later, did not hear the slightest sound of the shots. He only saw how the factory worker suddenly slumped down in the ropes for some reason, how blood appeared in 2 places, and how the ropes became loose under the weight of the sagging body. And the factory worker sat down, lowering his head and tucking his legs under unnaturally. Pierre ran to the post. No one held him back. Frightened, pale people were doing something around the factory worker. The lower jaw of one old mustached Frenchman was trembling as he untied the ropes. The body sank down. The soldiers carried it clumsily and hastily behind the post and began to push it down into the pit. They all obviously knew without question that they were criminals who had to quickly conceal the traces of their crime. Pierre glanced into the pit and saw the factory worker lying there, his knees up close to his head, one shoulder higher than the other, and that shoulder was rising and falling convulsively and regularly. But shovelfuls of earth were already being strewn over the whole body. One of the soldiers angrily, spitefully, and morbidly shouted at Pierre to get back, but Pierre did not understand him and stood by the post, and nobody drove him away. When the pit was all filled, a command was heard. Pierre was taken to his place, and the French troops, standing in line on both sides of the post, made a half turn and started marching past it at a measured pace. The 24 riflemen with discharged muskets who stood in the center of the circle ran to take their places as their companies marched past them. Pierre now looked with senseless eyes at these riflemen who ran out from the circle in pairs. All except one joined their companies. A young soldier with a deathly pale face, his shako pushed back, his musket lowered, went on standing across from the pit in the place from which he had fired. He was reeling like a drunk man, taking a few steps forward and then back to support his falling body. An old sergeant ran out from the ranks and, seizing the young soldier's arm, pulled him into the company. The crowd of Russians and Frenchmen began to disperse. They all walked away silently with lowered heads. Salut apprendre à incendier. That'll teach him to set fires, someone among the Frenchmen said. Pierre glanced around at the speaker and saw that it was a soldier who wanted to comfort himself, at least somehow, for what had been done, but could not. Without finishing what he was saying, he waved his arm and walked away. Section 12. After the execution, Pierre was separated from the other accused and left alone in a small, devastated, and befouled church. Before evening, a sergeant of the guards came into the church with 2 soldiers and announced to Pierre that he was pardoned and would now go to the barracks of the prisoners of war. Not understanding what was being said to him, Pierre got up and went with the soldiers. He was brought to some sheds built at the top of the field out of charred boards, beams, and rafters, and led into one of them. In the darkness, some 20 different people surrounded him. Pierre looked at them, not understanding who these people were, and why, and what they wanted of him. He heard the words said to him, but did not draw any conclusion from them or apply them to anything. He did not understand their meaning. He replied to what he was asked, but did not reflect on who was listening to him and how his replies would be taken. He looked at their faces and figures, but they all seemed equally meaningless to him. For the moment when Pierre saw this horrible murder performed by people who did not want to do it, it was as if the spring that upheld everything and made it seem alive had been pulled from his soul, and it had all collapsed into a heap of meaningless trash. Though he did not account for it to himself, his faith in the world's good order, in humanity and his own soul, and in God was destroyed. Pierre had experienced this state before, but never with such force as now. Before, when doubts of this sort had come to Pierre, those doubts had had their source in his own guilt, and deep in his soul, Pierre had felt that the salvation from that despair and those doubts lay in himself. But now he felt that it was not his guilt that caused the world to collapse in front of his eyes and leave only meaningless ruins. He felt that to return to faith in life was not in his power. People stood around him in the darkness. Surely something in him interested them very much. They were telling him something, asking him about something. Then they led him somewhere, and he finally found himself in the corner of the shed, next to some people who were talking and laughing on all sides. And so, brothers, that same prince who, the voice of someone in an opposite corner of the shed was saying, with special emphasis on the word who. Sitting silently and motionlessly by the wall on some straw, Pierre now closed his eyes. But as soon as he closed his eyes, he saw before him the same frightful face of the factory worker, especially frightening in its simplicity, and the face of his involuntary murderers, still more frightened in their anxiety. And he would open his eyes again and look senselessly into the darkness around him. Next to him, bending over, sat some little man whose presence Pierre first noticed by the strong smell of sweat that came from him with his every movement. This man was doing something with his feet in the darkness, and though Pierre could not see his face, he felt that this man was constantly glancing at him. When his eyes got used to the darkness, Pierre realized that this man was taking off his foot cloths, and the way he was doing it aroused Pierre's interest. Having untied the strips with which one foot was bound, he folded them neatly, and at once began on the other foot, glancing up at Pierre. While one hand was hanging up the first strips, the other was already beginning to unwrap the other foot. In this accurate fashion, with rounded, deft movements that followed one another without pause, the man unwrapped his feet, hung the wrappings on a peg above his head, took out a pocket knife, cut something off, folded the knife, put it under his pillow, and settling himself more comfortably, put his arms around his raised knees, and fixed his eyes directly on Pierre. Pierre felt something pleasant, soothing, and rounded in these deft movements, in this well-arranged domain of his in the corner, even in the smell of this man, and he looked at him without taking his eyes away. "So you've seen a lot of misery, mister, eh?" the little man suddenly said, and in the man's melodious voice there was such an expression of tenderness and simplicity that Pierre wanted to reply, but his jaw trembled and he felt tears rising. The little man, in the same second, not giving Pierre time to show his confusion, spoke in the same pleasant voice. "Ah, don't grieve, little falcon," he said with that tenderly melodious gentleness with which old Russian women speak. "Don't grieve, little friend. You suffer an hour, you live an age. So it is, my friend. And we live here, thank God, with no offense. There's bad people and there's good," he said, and while speaking, shifted his weight to his knees in a supple movement, got up, and cleared his throat, went somewhere. "So she's come, the rascal," Pierre heard the same gentle voice from the end of the shed. "She's come, the rascal, she remembers. Well, well enough." And the soldier, pushing away a little dog that was jumping up to him, came back to his place and sat down. In his hands there was something wrapped in a rag. "Here, have a bite to eat, master," he said, returning again to his respectful tone and unwrapping and offering Pierre several baked potatoes. There was soup for dinner, but the potatoes are grand." Pierre had not eaten all day, and the smell of the potatoes seemed extraordinarily pleasant to him. He thanked the soldier and began to eat. "What, just like that?" the soldier said, smiling, and he took one of the potatoes. "Do it this way." He took out his pocket knife, cut the potato into 2 equal halves on his palm, and sprinkled them with salt from the rag, and offered them to Pierre. "Grand potatoes," he repeated. "That's the way to eat them." It seemed to Pierre that he had never eaten anything tastier. "No, I'm all right," said Pierre, "but why did they shoot those unfortunate men? The last one was about 20. "Tsk, tsk," said the little man. "What a sin, what a sin," he added quickly, and as if his words had always been ready in his mouth and flew out of it inadvertently, he went on. "Why is it, master, that you stayed in Moscow like this?" "I didn't think they'd come so quickly. I stayed by chance," said Pierre. "How did they take you, little falcon? From your own house?" "No, I went to the fire, and they seized me and tried me for arson." "Where there's laws, there's lies," the little man put in. "Have you been here long?" asked Pierre, chewing the last potato. "Me? They took me on Sunday from a hospital in Moscow." "And what are you, a soldier?" "Soldiers of the Apsheronsky regiment. I was dying of fever. Nobody told us anything. There were about 20 of our men lying there. We never thought, never imagined." "And what, is it sad for you here?" asked Pierre. "How could it not be, little falcon? My name's Platon, last name Karatev," he added, evidently to make it easier for Pierre to address him. "They nicknamed me Little Falcon in the service. How can you not be sad, little falcon? Moscow, she's the mother of cities. How can you not be sad looking at that? Well, the worm gnaws the cabbage, but dies when he's done. That's what the old folks used to say," he added quickly. "What? What's that you said?" asked Pierre. "Me," said Karatev. "I said man proposes, God disposes," he said, thinking he was repeating what he had said, and he went on at once. "So then, master, have you got family estates and a house? So the cup's overflowing and a wife? Are your old parents still living?" he asked, and though Pierre could not see in the darkness, he sensed that the soldier's lips were puckered in a restrained smile of tenderness as he asked him these things. He was clearly upset that Pierre had no parents, especially no mother. "A wife for advice, a mother-in-law for welcome, but there's no one dearer than your own mother," he said. "Well, but are there children?" he went on, asking. Pierre's negative answer clearly upset him, and he hastened to add, "So what? You're young folk. God grant you'll still have time. Only live in good accord." "It doesn't matter now," Pierre said involuntarily. "Ah, you dear man," Platon retorted. "There's no safety from the beggar's sack or the prison's bars." He settled himself more comfortably and cleared his throat, evidently preparing to tell a long story. "And so, my gentle friend, I used to live at home," he began. "Our estate was a prosperous one. There was lots of land. The muzhiks lived well, and so did our household, thank God. My good father went out to mow with 6 of us. We lived well. There were real Christian peasants. Then once, and Platon Karatev told a long story of how he had went to another man's copse beyond the forest and got caught by the watchmen, and how they flogged him, tried him, and sent him for a soldier. What then, little falcon? He said in a voice altered by a smile. We thought it was grief, but it was joy. If it wasn't for my sin, my brother would have had to go, and my younger brother had 4 children, while I only had my wife left. You see, there was a daughter, but God took her before I was sent for a soldier. I came home on leave, I'll tell you. They're living better than ever. A yard full of little stomachs, the women are at home, 2 brothers are off doing hired work. Only the youngest, Mikhailo, is there. My good father says, all my children are the same to me, he says. Whichever finger you bite, it hurts. But if Platon hadn't been sent, then Mikhailo would have had to go. He called us all together. Would you believe it? Stood us under the icons. Mikhailo, he says, come here and bow down to his feet, and you woman, bow down, and you grandchildren bow down too, understand, he said. That's how things are, my gentle friend. Fate seeks ahead, but we keep judging. This isn't good. This isn't right. Our luck is like water in a fishnet. Drag it and it swells. Pull it out and there's nothing there. So it is. And Platon shifted on his straw. After some silence, Platon got up. I suppose you must be sleepy, he said, and he quickly began crossing himself, saying, Lord Jesus Christ, Saint Nicholas, Frola and Lavra, Lord Jesus Christ, Saint Nicholas, Frola and Lavra, Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on us and save us, he concluded, bowing to the ground, stood up and sighing, sat on his straw. So there, Lord, lay me down like a stone, raise me up like a loaf, he said, and lay down, pulling his greatcoat over him. What was that prayer you recited? Asked Pierre. Eh? Said Platon. He was already asleep. What did I recite? I prayed to God. What? Don't you pray? No, I do pray, said Pierre, but what was it you said? Frola and Lavra? Of course, Platon replied quickly. It's the horse's feast. Beasts should also be pitied, said Karatev. Look how she's curled up, the little rascal. Got nice and warm, the daughter of a bitch, he said, touching the dog at his feet, and turning over, he fell asleep at once. Outside, weeping and shouting could be heard somewhere in the distance, and fire could be seen through the cracks in the shed, but inside the shed it was quiet and dark. Pierre did not fall asleep for a long time and lay in his place in the dark with open eyes, listening to the regular snoring of Platon, who was lying beside him, and he felt that the previously destroyed world was now arising in his soul with a new beauty on some new and unshakable foundation. Section 13. In the shed that Pierre entered, and in which he stayed for 4 weeks, 23 soldiers, 3 officers, and 2 officials were held prisoner. Later, Pierre pictured them all as in a fog, but Platon Karatev remained forever in Pierre's soul as the strongest and dearest memory and the embodiment of everything Russian, kindly and round. When at dawn the next day Pierre saw his neighbor, his first impression of something round was fully confirmed. The whole figure of Platon in his French greatcoat tied with a rope, in a peaked cap and bast shoes, was round. His head was perfectly round, his back, chest, and shoulders, even his arms, which he held as if always about to embrace something, were round. His pleasant smile and his large, brown, tender eyes were round. Platon Karatev must have been over 50, judging by his stories of the campaigns he had taken part in long ago as a soldier. He himself did not know and had no way of determining how old he was, but his teeth, bright white and strong, which kept popping out in 2 semicircles when he laughed, which he often did, were all sound and intact, and there was not a single gray hair in his beard or on his head, and his whole body had an air of suppleness and especially of firmness and hardness. His face, especially its small, round wrinkles, had an expression of innocence and youth. His voice was pleasant and melodious, but the main peculiarity of his speech consisted in its immediacy and promptness. He evidently never thought of what he had to say or would say, and owing to that, there was in the quickness and certainty of his intonation a special, irresistible persuasiveness. His physical strength and agility in the first period of captivity was such that it seemed he did not understand what fatigue and illness were. Every evening he said as he lay down, Lord, lay me down like a stone, raise me up like a loaf. In the morning, getting up, he always said, shaking his shoulders in the same way, lay down in a curl, got up in a whirl. And indeed, he had only to lie down in order to fall asleep at once like a stone, and he had only to shake himself in order to get up and set about doing something at once without a second's delay, the way children, on getting up, take their toys. He knew how to do everything, not very well, but not badly either. He baked, cooked, sewed, planed, and cobbled boots. He was always busy, and only at night allowed himself to talk, which he liked to do, and to sing. He sang songs not as singers do, who know they are being listened to, but as birds do, apparently because it was necessary for him to utter those sounds, as it is necessary to stretch one's arms or legs, and those sounds were always high, tender, almost feminine, mournful, and his face would be very serious as he sang them. Having been taken prisoner and grown a beard, he had evidently thrown off everything assumed, alien, soldierly, and involuntarily returned to his former peasant, folkish ways. A soldier on leave is an untucked shirt, he used to say. He talked reluctantly about his time as a soldier, though he did not complain and often repeated that during all his time in the service he had never been beaten once. When he told stories, they were mostly stories from his old and apparently dear memories of Christian, as he pronounced, Christian life. The proverbs that filled his speech were not those mostly indecent and bold proverbs that soldiers use, but those folk sayings which sound so insignificant taken separately, and which suddenly acquire a profoundly wise significance when spoken aptly. He often said something completely opposite to what he had said before, but both the one and the other were right. He liked to speak and spoke well, adorning his speech with endearments and sayings which, it seemed to Pierre, he made up himself. But the main charm of his stories was that in what he said, the simplest events, sometimes the same that Pierre had seen without noticing them, acquired a character of solemn seemliness. He liked listening to folk tales, which one soldier used to tell in the evenings, always the same ones, but most of all he liked listening to the stories from real life. He smiled joyfully, listened to such stories, putting a word in and asking questions, tending towards clarifying for himself the seemliness of what he was being told. Karatev had no attachments, friendship, or love, as Pierre understood them, but he loved and lived lovingly with everything that life brought his way, especially other people. Not any specific people, but those who were there before his eyes. He loved his mutt, his comrades, the French. He loved Pierre, who was his neighbor, but Pierre sensed that, despite all his gentle tenderness towards him, by which he involuntarily gave Pierre's spiritual life its due, Karatev would not have been upset for a moment to be parted with him, and Pierre was beginning to experience the same feelings towards Karatev. Platon Karatev was, for all the other prisoners, the most extraordinary of soldiers. They called him Little Falcon, or Platosha, teasing him good-naturedly, sent him on errands. But for Pierre he remained forever as he had seen him in the first night, the unfathomable, round, and eternal embodiment of the spirit of simplicity and truth. Platon Karatev knew nothing by heart except his prayer. When he began to talk, it seemed he did not know how he was going to finish. When Pierre, sometimes struck by the meaning of what he said, asked him to repeat it, Platon could not remember what he had said the moment before, just as he could not tell Pierre the words of his favorite song. There was in it, my dear one, little birch tree, and I'm sick at heart. But the words did not make any sense. He did not and could not understand the meaning of the words taken separately from speech. Each of his words and each of his acts was the manifestation of an activity he knew nothing about, which was his life. But his life, as he looked at it, had no meaning as a separate life. It had meaning only as part of the whole, which he constantly sensed. His words and acts poured out of him as evenly, necessarily, and immediately as fragrance comes from a flower. He was unable to understand either the value or the meaning of a word or act taken separately. Section 14. On receiving from Nikolai the news that her brother was with the Rostovs and Yaroslav, Princess Maria, despite her aunt's dissuasions, at once made ready to go, and not just by herself, but with her nephew. Whether it was difficult or not difficult, impossible or possible, she did not ask and did not want to know. Her duty was not only to be at the side of her perhaps dying brother, but to do everything possible so as to bring his son to him, and therefore she made ready to go. If Prince Andrei had not informed her himself, Princess Maria explained it by his being too weak to ride or considering the trip too difficult and dangerous for her and his son. In a few days, Princess Maria was ready for the road. Her carriages consisted of the enormous princely coach in which she had come to Vorennes, a britska, and a cart. And with her went Mademoiselle Bourienne, Nikolushka and his tutor, the old nanny, 3 maids, Tikhon, a young servant, and a footman whom her aunt sent with her. To go by the usual road to Moscow was unthinkable, and Princess Marya, therefore, had to take a roundabout way through Lipetsk, Ryazan, Vladimir, and Shuya, which was very long, and post-horses, being unavailable everywhere, very hard, and near Ryazan, where, they said, the French had appeared, even dangerous. During this difficult journey, Mademoiselle Bourienne, de Sales, and Princess Maria's servants were astonished by her firmness of spirit and energy. She was the last to go to bed, the first to get up, and no difficulty could stop her. Thanks to her activity and energy, which aroused her companions, by the end of the 2nd week, they were approaching Yaroslav. In the latter part of her stay in Vorennes, Princess Marya had experienced the best happiness of her life. Her love for Rostov no longer worried or upset her. That love filled all her soul, became an unalienable part of her, and she no longer fought against it. Most recently, Princess Marya had become convinced, though she never said it definitely to herself in clear terms, that she loved and was loved. She had become convinced of it during her last meeting with Nikolai, when he came to her to announce that her brother was with the Rostovs. Nikolai had never hinted by so much as a word that now, in case of Prince Andrei's recovery, the former relations between him and Natasha might be renewed, but Princess Marya had seen by his face that he knew and thought of it, and in spite of that, his attitude towards her, careful, tender, and loving, not only had not changed, but he seemed to be glad that this family relation between him and Princess Marya now allowed him to express more freely his loving friendship for her, as Princess Marya sometimes thought of it. Princess Marya knew that she was in love for the first and last time of her life, and felt that she was loved and was happy and calm in that respect. But this happiness of one side of her soul not only did not prevent her from feeling the full force of her grief for her brother, but on the contrary, this inner calm in one respect gave her a greater opportunity to give herself fully to her feelings for her brother. That feeling was so strong in the first moments of the departure from Vorennes that those who saw her off were convinced, looking at her careworn, desperate face, that she would certainly fall ill on the road. But it was precisely the difficulties and cares of the journey, which Princess Marya took in hand so energetically, that saved her for a time from grief and gave her strength. As always happens during a journey, Princess Marya thought only about the journey itself, forgetting its goal. But as they approached Yaroslav, when there again emerged what she might face, and not after many days, but that same evening, Princess Marya's agitation reached the utmost limits. When the footman who had been sent ahead to find out where the Rostovs were staying in Yaroslav and what condition Prince Andrei was in, met the big coach entering the town, he was horrified to see the princess's terribly pale face thrusting out at him through the window. "I found out everything, Your Excellency. The Rostovs are staying on the square in the house of the merchant Bronnikov. It's not far, just on the bank of the Volga," said the footman. Princess Marya looked fearfully and questioningly into his face, not understanding why he did not answer the main question. How was her brother? Mademoiselle Bourienne put this question instead of the princess. "How is the prince?" she asked. "His Excellency is staying in the same house with them." "That means he's alive," thought the princess, and she asked softly how he was. "The people say he's still in the same condition." What "still in the same condition" meant, the princess did not ask, but with only a fleeting, imperceptible glance at the 7-year-old Nikolushka, who sat facing her and was happy to see the city, she lowered her head and did not raise it until the heavy coach, rumbling, shaking, and heaving, stopped somewhere. The footboards banged as they were thrown down. The doors were opened. To the left there was water, a big river. To the right was a porch. On the porch there were people, servants, and a red-cheeked girl with a big black braid, who smiled unpleasantly and falsely, as it seemed to Princess Marya. This was Sonia. The princess ran up the steps. The girl with the false smile said, this way," and the princess found herself in a front room before an old woman with an oriental-type face, who, with a moved expression, was quickly coming to meet her. It was the countess. She embraced Princess Marya and started kissing her. "Mon enfant," she said, "je vous aime et je vous connais depuis longtemps." "My child, I love you and have known you for a long time." Despite all her agitation, Princess Marya realized that this was the Countess and that she had to say something to her. Not knowing why herself, she uttered some polite French words in the same tone in which she had been spoken to and asked, "How is he?" "The doctor says there's no danger," said the Countess, but as she said it, she lifted up her eyes with a sigh, and the expression of this gesture contradicted her words. "Where is he? May I see him? May I?" asked the princess. "At once, princess. At once, my dear. Is this his son?" she said, turning to Nikolushka, who was coming in with Desales. "There's room for us all. The house is big. Oh, what a lovely boy." The Countess led the princess into the drawing room. Sonia was talking with Mademoiselle Bourrienne. The Countess caressed the boy. The old Count came into the room and greeted the princess. The old Count had changed greatly since the princess had last seen him. Then he had been a sprightly, cheerful, self-confident old man. Now he seemed a pitiful, lost person. Talking with the princess, he constantly looked around as if asking everyone if he was doing the right thing. After the devastation of Moscow and his property, thrown out of his usual rut, he had clearly lost the awareness of his significance and felt that he no longer had any place in life. Despite all her agitation, despite her one desire to see her brother as soon as possible, and her vexation that at that moment, when all she wanted was to see him, they distracted her and pretended to praise her nephew, the princess noticed everything that was going on around her and felt the need to submit for a time to this new order she was entering. She knew that all this was necessary, and though it was hard for her, she was not vexed with them. "This is my niece," said the Count, addressing Sonia. "Have you met her, princess?" The princess turned to her and, trying to stifle the animosity for this girl that arose in her heart, kissed her. But she was beginning to be pained because the mood of everyone around her was so far from all that was in her soul. "Where is he?" she asked at once, addressing them all. "He's downstairs. Natasha's with him," Sonia replied, blushing. "I've sent to inquire. You must be tired, princess." Tears of vexation came to the princess's eyes. She turned away and was again about to ask the countess how to go to him, when light, impetuous, as if merry footsteps were heard at the door. The princess looked and saw Natasha almost running in, that Natasha whom she had disliked so much when they met in Moscow long ago. But the princess had barely glanced at the face of this Natasha when she understood that this was a sincere companion in grief, and therefore her friend. She rushed to meet her and embraced her, burst into tears on her shoulder. As soon as Natasha, who had been sitting by Prince Andrei's head, learned of Princess Maria's arrival, she quietly left the room on those quick steps, merry as it had seemed to Princess Maria, and ran to her. On her anxious face when she ran into the room, there was only one expression, an expression of love, of boundless love for him, for her, for everything that was close to the man she loved, an expression of pity, of suffering for others, and a passionate desire to give all of herself to help them. It was clear that at that moment there was not a single thought of herself or her relations to him in Natasha's soul. The sensitive Princess Maria understood all that from her first glance at Natasha's face, and with a grieving pleasure she wept on her shoulder. Come to him, Marie," said Natasha, leading her to the other room. Princess Maria raised her face, wiped her tears, and turned to Natasha. She felt that from her she would understand and learn everything. "How is—" she began the question, but suddenly stopped. She felt that it was impossible to ask, either ask or to answer in words. Natasha's face and eyes would tell her more clearly and profoundly. Natasha looked at her, but seemed to be afraid and doubtful whether to tell all she knew. It was as if she felt, before those luminous eyes, which penetrated to the very bottom of her heart, that it was impossible not to tell the whole truth as she knew it. Natasha's lips suddenly trembled, ugly wrinkles formed around her mouth, and bursting into sobs, she covered her face with her hands. Princess Maria understood everything. But even so she hoped and asked in words she did not believe. "But how is his wound? What condition is he in generally?" You'll see," was all Natasha could say. They sat for a while downstairs near his room in order to stop crying and to go in with calm faces. "How has the whole illness gone? Has he been worse for long? When did this happen?" asked Princess Maria. Natasha told her that at first there had been danger from his high fever and suffering, but in the Trinity Monastery that had gone away, and the doctor had been afraid of only one thing, the gangrene. But that danger too had passed. When they arrived in Yaroslav, the wound had begun to fester. Natasha knew everything to do with festering and so on, and the doctor had said that the festering might take the right course. There was fever. The doctor had said that this fever was not dangerous. But 2 days ago, Natasha began, this suddenly happened. She suppressed her sobs. "I don't know, but you'll see how he's become." "He's grown thinner, weaker?" asked the princess. No, not that, but worse. You'll see. Ah, Marie, Marie, he's too good. He can't live because... Section 15. When Natasha opened the door with a habitual movement, letting the princess go ahead of her, Princess Marya felt her sobs ready in her throat. Much as she had prepared herself and tried to calm down, she knew she would not be able to see him without tears. Princess Marya understood what Natasha had meant by the words, "This happened to him 2 days ago." She understood that it meant he had suddenly softened, and that this softening and tender feeling were signs of death. As she was going to the door, she already saw in her imagination the face of the Andrushka she had known in childhood, gentle, mild, tender, which he showed so rarely and which, therefore, always affected her so strongly. She knew that he would speak quiet, gentle words to her, like those her father had spoken to her before his death, and she would be unable to bear it and would burst into sobs over him. But sooner or later it had to be, and so she went into the room. The sobs rose higher and higher in her throat as her nearsighted eyes made out his form more and more clearly and saw his features, and then she saw his face and met his gaze. He was lying on a sofa surrounded by pillows, in a squirrel-fur dressing gown. He was thin and pale. One thin, transparently white hand was holding a handkerchief. The other, with a quiet movement of the fingers, was touching his thin, newly grown mustache. His eyes were looking at the entering women. Seeing his face and meeting his gaze, Princess Marya suddenly slowed her steps and felt that her tears had suddenly dried up and her sobs had ceased. Catching the expression of his face and gaze, she suddenly grew timid and felt guilty. "But what am I guilty of?" she asked. "Of being alive and thinking about the living while I—" His cold, stern gaze replied. There was almost hostility in that deep gaze, looking not out of, but into it himself, as he slowly examined his sister in Natasha. They took each other's hands and kissed each other, as was their habit. "Hello, Marie. How is it you got here?" he said in a voice as flat and alien as his gaze. If he had shrieked in a desperate voice, that shriek would have terrified Princess Marya less than the sound of that voice. "And you've brought Nikolushka?" he said just as flatly and slowly, and with an obvious effort at recollection. "How is your health now?" asked Princess Marya, marveling at herself as she said it. "That, my friend, you must ask the doctor," he said, and clearly making another effort to be general, he said with his lips only, it was clearly that he did not at all think about what he was saying, "Merci, chérie amie, d'être venu." Thank you, my dear friend, for coming. Princess Marya pressed his hand. He winced barely noticeably from the pressure of her hand. He was silent, and she did not know what to say. She understood what had happened to him in those 2 days. In his words, in his tone, especially in that gaze, a cold, almost hostile gaze, there could be felt an alienation from everything of this world that was frightening in a living man. He clearly had difficulty now in understanding anything living, but at the same time it could be felt that he did not understand the living, not because he lacked the power of understanding, but because he understood something else, such as the living could not understand, and which absorbs him entirely. "Yes, see how strangely fate has brought us together," he said, breaking his silence and pointing at Natasha. "She's taking care of me." Princess Marya listened and did not understand what he was saying. How could he, the sensitive, gentle Prince Andrei, say that in the presence of the one he loved and who loved him? If he had thought he would live, he would not have said it in such a coldly offensive tone. If he had not known he would die, how could he not have pitied her? How could he have said it in front of her? The only explanation could be it made no difference to him. It made no difference because something else more important had been revealed to him. The conversation was cold, incoherent, and constantly interrupted. "Marie came through Ryazan," said Natasha. Prince Andrei did not notice that she called his sister Marie. Natasha, calling her that in his presence, noticed it herself for the first time. "Well, and what about it?" he said. "They told her that Moscow is all burned down completely, that supposedly—" Natasha stopped. It was impossible to speak. He was obviously making an effort to listen and still could not. "Yes, they say it's burned down," he said. "That's a great pity." And he began to look straight ahead, absent-mindedly stroking his mustache with his fingers. "And you've met Count Nikolai, Marie?" Prince Andrei said suddenly, clearly wishing to please them. "He wrote here that he found you very much to his liking," he went on simply, calmly, clearly unable to understand all the complex significance his word had for living people. If you should also like him, it would be very good. If you got married, he added somewhat more quickly, as if glad the words he had long been searching for and had finally found. Princess Marya heard his words, but they had no other meaning for her than to prove how terribly far he now was from everything living. "Why talk of me?" she said calmly, and glanced at Natasha. Natasha, feeling her gaze upon her, did not look at her. Again they fell silent. "Andrei, would you... Princess Marya suddenly said in a shuddering voice, "Would you like to see Nikolushka? He talks about you all the time." Prince Andrei barely smiled perceptibly for the first time, for Princess Marya, who knew his face so well, understood with horror that this was a smile not of joy, not of tenderness for his son, but of quiet, mild mockery of Princess Marya, who, in his opinion, was using her last means of bringing him to his senses. "Yes, I'm very glad Nikolushka is here. Is he well?" When Nikolushka was brought to Prince Andrei, he looked at his father with fear, but did not cry because no one was crying. Prince Andrei kissed him and obviously did not know what to say to him. When Nikolushka was sent away, Princess Marya went up to her brother once more, kissed him, and unable to control herself any longer, began to cry. He looked at her intently. "Is it about Nikolushka?" he asked. Princess Marya, crying, nodded affirmatively. "Marie, do you know the gossip?" He suddenly fell silent. "What did you say?" "Nothing. You mustn't cry here," he said, looking at her with the same cold gaze. When Princess Marya began to cry, he understood that she was crying because Nikolushka would be left without a father. Making a great effort with himself, he attempted to come back into life and shift to their point of view. "Yes, this must seem pitiful to them," he thought, "yet it's so simple. The birds of the air neither sow nor reap, but your father feeds them," he said to himself, and wanted to say it to the princess. But no, they'll understand it in their own way, and they won't understand. This they cannot understand, that all these feelings they value, all these thoughts of ours, which seem so important to us, that they're unnecessary. We cannot understand each other. And he kept silent. Prince Andrei's little son was 7 years old. He could barely read, he knew nothing. He lived through many things after that day, acquiring knowledge, power of observation, experience. But if he had been possessed all these abilities he acquired later, he would not have been able to understand the full meaning of the scene he saw take place between his father, Princess Marya, and Natasha any more profoundly than he understood it now. He understood everything, and without crying left the room, silently went up to Natasha, who came out after him, glanced up at her bashfully with his thoughtful, beautiful eyes. His slightly raised, red upper lip quivered. He leaned his head against Natasha and began to cry. From that day on, he avoided Dessalles, avoided the Countess, who caressed him, and either sat by himself or timidly approached Princess Marya and Natasha, whom he seemed to have come to love more than his aunt, and quietly and bashfully caressed them. Princess Marya, having left Prince Andrei, fully understood that all that Natasha's face had said to her. She did not talk any more with Natasha about the hope of saving his life. She took turns with her by his sofa, and did not cry any more, but prayed constantly, in her soul addressing the eternal, the unfathomable, whose presence over the dying man was now so palpable. Section 16. Prince Andrei not only knew that he would die, but he felt that he was dying, that he was already half dead. He experienced an awareness of estrangement from everything earthly and a joyful, silent, strange lightness of being. Without haste or worry, he waited for what lay ahead of him. The dread, the eternal, the unknown and far off, of which he had never ceased to feel the presence throughout his life, was now close to him. By that strange lightness of being he experienced, almost incomprehensible and palpable. Formerly he had been afraid of the end. Twice he had experienced that frightful, tormenting feeling of the fear of death, the end, and now he no longer understood it. The first time he had experienced that feeling was when the shell was spinning before him like a top, and he looked at the harvested field, at the bushes, at the sky, and knew that death was before him. When he regained consciousness after being wounded, and in his soul, instantly, as if freed of the restraining weight of life, that flower of love opened, eternal, free, not bound to this life, he was no longer afraid of death and did not think of it. In those days of suffering, solitude, and half delirium that he spent after being wounded, The more he pondered the new principle of eternal love revealed to him, the more, though without feeling it himself, he renounced earthly love. To love everything, everybody, always, to sacrifice oneself for love, meant to love no one, meant not to live this earthly life. And the more imbued he was with this principle of love, the more he renounced life, and the more completely he destroyed that dreadful barrier which, without love, stands between life and death. When in that first time he remembered that he had to die, he said to himself, "Well, so much the better." But after that night in Maestici, when in his half-delirium she whom he wished for appeared before him, and when, pressing her hand to his lips, he wept quiet, joyful tears, love for one woman crept imperceptibly into his heart and again bound him to life. Joyful and worried thoughts started coming to him. Remembering that moment at the dressing station when he had seen Corrigan, he now could not return to that feeling. He was tormented by the question of whether the man was still alive, and he did not dare ask. His illness was following its physical course, but what Natasha called "this happened to him" occurred 2 days before Princess Maria's arrival. It was the last moral struggle between life and death, in which death gained the victory. It was the unexpected awareness that he still valued his life, as it presented itself to him in his love for Natasha, and at last finally surmounted attack of terror before the unknown. It was in the evening. As usual, after dinner, he was in a slightly feverish state, and his thoughts were extremely clear. Sonia was sitting at the table. He dozed off. Suddenly a sense of happiness came over him. "Ah, it's that she's come," he thought. Indeed, Natasha, who had just come in with inaudible steps, was sitting in Sonia's place. Since she had begun to take care of him, he had always experienced this physical sense of her nearness. She was sitting in an armchair, turned sideways to him, shielding the light of the candle from him, and knitting a stocking. She had learned to knit stockings since Prince Andrei told her that no one could take such good care of the sick as old nannies who knit stockings, and that there was something soothing about the knitting of stockings. Her slender fingers moved quickly, occasionally clicking the needles, and he could see clearly the thoughtful profile of her lowered head. She made a movement, the ball of yarn rolled off her lap. She gave a start, glanced around at him, and shielding the candle with her hand, bent down in a cautious, supple, and precise movement, picked up the ball and sat in her former position. He looked at her without stirring and saw that, after her movement, she needed to take a deep breath, but did not dare to do it, and caught her breath cautiously. In the Trinity Monastery, they had talked about the past, and he had told her that if he should live, he would eternally thank God for his wound, which had brought them together again. But since then, they had never talked about the future. Could it be or not? He now thought, looking at her and listening to the slight noise of the steel needles. Can it be that fate brought us together so strangely only so that I should die? Can it be that the truth of life was revealed to me only so that I should live in a lie? I love her more than anything in the world, but what am I to do if I love her? He said, and suddenly moaned involuntarily by a habit acquired during his suffering. Hearing this sound, Natasha put down the stocking, leaned in his direction, and suddenly noticing his shining eyes, went over to him on light steps and bent down. "You're not asleep?" "No, I've been looking at you for a long time. I felt it when you came in. No one but you gives me that soft silence, that light. I want to weep for joy." Natasha moved closer to him. Her face beamed with rapturous joy. "Natasha, I love you too much, more than anything in the world." "And I?" She turned away for a moment. "Why too much?" she asked. "Why too much? Well, what do you think? What do you feel in your soul, in your whole soul? Will I live? How does it seem to you?" "I'm sure of it. Sure of it," Natasha almost cried out, taking both his hands in a passionate movement. He was silent for a moment. "How good it would be." And taking her hand, he kissed it. Natasha was happy and excited, and she remembered at once that this was forbidden, that he needed to be quiet. "You didn't sleep, though," she said, suppressing her joy. "Try to fall asleep, please." He let go of her hand after pressing it, and she went over to the candle and sat down in the same position. Twice she turned to glance at him, and his eyes shone, meeting hers. She set to work on the stocking and said to herself that she would not look at him until it was finished. Indeed, soon after that he closed his eyes and fell asleep. He slept for a short time and suddenly woke up anxiously in a cold sweat. Falling asleep, he was thinking about the same thing he had been thinking about all the time, about life and death, and more about death. He felt himself closer to it. Love. What is love, he thought. Love hinders death. Love is life. Everything. Everything I understand only because I love. Everything exists only because I love. Everything is connected only by that. Love is God, and to die means that I, a part of love, return to common and eternal source. These thoughts seemed comforting to him. But they were only thoughts. Something was lacking in them. There was something one-sidedly personal, cerebral. There was no evidence. And there was the same uneasiness and vagueness. He fell asleep. In a dream, he saw himself lying in the same room in which he lay in reality, but he was not wounded, but healthy. Many sorts of persons, insignificant, indifferent, appeared before Prince Andrei. He talks with them, argues something unnecessarily. They are preparing to go somewhere. Prince Andrei vaguely recalls that it is all insignificant and that he has other, more important concerns, but he goes on, to their surprise, speaking some sort of empty, witty words. Gradually, imperceptibly, all these people begin to disappear, and everything is replaced by the one question of a closed door. He gets up and goes to the door to slide the bolt and lock it. Everything depends on whether he does or does not manage to lock it. He walks, he hurries, his feet do not move. He knows that he will not manage to lock the door, but still he painfully strains with all his force, and a tormenting fear seizes him. And this fear is the fear of death. It is standing beyond the door. But as he is crawling strengthlessly and awkwardly towards the door, this terrible something is already pushing against it from the other side, forcing it. Something inhuman, death, is forcing the door, and he has to hold it shut. He lays hold of the door, strains in a last effort to lock it again. To lock it is already impossible, just to hold it shut. But his attempts are weak, clumsy, and pushed by the terrible thing, the door keeps opening and shutting again. Once more it pushes from the other side. His last supernatural efforts are in vain, and the two halves open noiselessly. It comes in, and it is death. And Prince Andrei died. But in the same instant that he died, Prince Andrei remembered that he was asleep, and in the same instant that he died, he made an effort with himself and woke up. Yes, that was death. I died. I woke up. Yes, death is an awakening. Clarity suddenly came to his soul, and the curtain that until then had concealed the unknown was raised before his inner gaze. He saw the release of a force that previously had been as if bound in him, and that strange lightness which from then on did not leave him. When, having come to in a cold sweat, he stirred on his sofa, and Natasha went over to him and asked what was the matter. He did not answer, and did not understand her, gave her a strange look. That was what had happened to him 2 days before Princess Maria's arrival. Since that day, the doctor said, the wasting fever had taken a turn for the worse, but Natasha was not interested in what the doctor said. She saw those dreadful moral signs which were more unquestionable for her. Since that day, there began for Prince Andrei, along with his awakening from sleep, an awakening from life. It seemed no slower to him in relation to this length of life than an awakening from a sleep in relation to the length of a dream. There was nothing frightening and abrupt in this relatively slow awakening. His last days and hours passed ordinarily and simply. Both Princess Maria and Natasha, who never left his side, felt it. They did not weep, did not shudder, and during the last time they themselves felt that they were no longer taking care of him. He was no longer there. He had left them. But of the nearest remainder of him, his body, the feelings of both were so strong that they were not affected by the external, dreadful side of death, and they found no need to exacerbate their grief. They did not weep either with him or without him, but also never spoke of him between themselves. They felt that they could not express what they understood in words. They both saw how he sank deeper and deeper, slowly and peacefully, somewhere away from them, and they both knew that it had to be so, and that it was good. He confessed, took communion. Everyone came to him for a last farewell. When his son was brought to him, he touched him with his lips and turned away, not because he felt grief or pity. Princess Maria and Natasha understood that, but only because he supposed that this was all that was expected of him. When he was told to bless him, he did as they requested and looked around as if asking if anything else needed to be done. When the last shudderings of the body being left by the spirit occurred, Princess Maria and Natasha were there. "Is it over?" said Princess Maria, after his body had already laid motionless before them for several minutes, growing cold. Natasha went up, looked into the dead eyes, and hastened to close them. She closed them and did not kiss them, but pressed her lips to that which was her nearest reminder of him. Where has he gone? Where is he now? When the clothed, wasted body lay in the coffin on the table, they all went up to it for a last farewell, and they wept. Nikolushka wept from a suffering bewilderment that rent his heart. The Countess and Sonia wept from pity for poor Natasha, and because he was no more. The old Count wept because he felt that soon he, too, would have to take that dreadful step. Natasha and Princess Marya also wept now, but they did not weep from their own personal grief. They wept from a reverent emotion that came over their souls from the awareness of the simple and solemn mystery of death that had been accomplished before them. And that is the end of 16, and also the end of part 1 of volume 4. And also the end of our dear Prince Andrei's life. Death comes to us all. Let's all leave it for there, and I'll see you guys tomorrow. Have a great day.